Hey everyone, so in case you guys missed the announcement, I am cutting it down to 2 lectures this week instead of the original 3 because our first lecture was really long and this one's probably going to be a little long as well. So I wanted to cut it down a little bit, and I'm going to take the information that we were going to go over as our third lecture and I'm going to lump that in with one of the lectures in week 5 because we have a little bit less to go through on that week. So anyway, this lecture is on invasives and disease, and you probably remember from a bunch of the previous lectures that alien species are considered one of the top 5 threats to imperiled species. In fact, it's the number 2 threat for imperiled species, and it affects 49% of our imperiled species. So it's particularly bad for plants and on islands like Hawaii. So before we get into types of invasive species, first we need to define a native species. So a native species, also called an indigenous species, is a species that is natively found in that area. So it occurs in the area due to its own dispersal abilities. So it can disperse there naturally, or it could have evolved in that area. So it's something that we had no impact on. We are not it's not there as a result of our activities. And the level of an ability for a species to disperse is called its vigility. And some species are able to disperse more readily, so they may have expanded their ranges, but if we had nothing to do with it, and it was just natural expansion, then they're still considered native species, because species do naturally expand over time. So it also doesn't matter when they became native. They could have become native millions of years ago, or they could have become native fairly recently. And this is as long as humans aren't involved. So an example of that would be like cattle egrets. Up until the early 1900s, they weren't found in North America or anywhere in the New World. But they appear to have dispersed on their own to South America from Africa, and then they dispersed north to North America. But because they arrived here on their own, they're considered a native species. So then we have the terms introduced and invasive. And a lot of times people will use these interchangeably, but they actually mean something different. So introduced can also, you can use the words non-native, non-indigenous, exotic, alien, foreign. Any of those are the same. But invasive is different. So many species have been introduced to new areas from human activity, and some of them are intentional, some of them are accidental. We'll get into cases of both of those later. But most species that are introduced are harmless or nearly harmless. So examples would be like corn and soybeans and cattle, sheep, tulips, daffodils, agricultural plants, livestock. Those are all things that are introduced to areas, but they're not considered invasive. And it's estimated that there's around 50,000 non-native species in the US, and most of them aren't harmful. But there is a subset of those 50,000 that cause problems, and those are the ones that we deem invasive. So an invasive species is defined as a non-native species that increases or expands at the expense of a native species. So they're always harmful in some way. And ecologists have proposed a tens rule to how many species will become invasive. So of all of the introduced species that are brought here, most of them don't make it. They don't survive. Only about 10% of them persist long enough to be considered casual. Then of that 10%, only 10% of the casual species become established. So that's only 1% of the overall species. And then from that, about 10% of those will become invasive. So again, now that's 0.1% of our introduced species become invasive. So it's really not that many when you look at the numbers, but their impact is huge. So if only 10% of introduced species actually persist, what are some of the reasons they're not persisting? And the reasons that sometimes we'll introduce a species and they won't survive, it could be that they're introduced to an area that's unsuitable habitat for them. It could be they're introduced to new diseases in this area that they had previously never been exposed to because they're not from there. There could be too much competition from native species. They could be introduced in a small number. Sometimes only a couple of animals get introduced or plants, and they're not able to reproduce fast enough to create a population. And we know that there are issues with small populations, such as reduced genetic diversity. So that's another issue that will come up, that they're not able to survive long because they don't have enough genetic diversity. So there are a lot of reasons why they wouldn't make it, but 0.1% of them make it, and they make it to the point where they are causing harm to the native species. So what makes a species good at becoming invasive? So what determines this 0.1%? What makes them different from all the other species? So there's a lot of characteristics that seem to be common amongst invasive species. So one example would be that they're disturbance adapted. So this is really helpful for them because disturbed areas, they usually have fewer competitors. There's not many species that are able to survive in disturbed areas. So they're relatively open areas for new species to fill. And if you can survive in that area, you kind of have the monopoly on that area. They also typically lack natural predators or pathogens. So if there's nothing that is getting rid of them, then they're going to be able to survive easier. A lot of times they are close relatives of native species, and the reason that is helpful is because they will share similar diets, share similar nutritional needs and environmental needs, meaning that they are able to survive in that environment. They're also a lot of the times allelopathic, which are organisms that secrete chemicals that deter competitors and modify the environment. So an example of that would be like garlic mustard. It's got a chemical that keeps other things from being able to grow with it, and being able to eat it a lot of the times. Some native species will do this too. So we have black walnut, which also has this trait. So it's not just invasive species, it's just a trait that makes invasives better at being invasive. A lot of times they'll also have high reproductive rates. So if you can reproduce faster, you can get more individuals in the environment, you can take over quicker. Short generation times, again, that's going into being able to create new individuals quickly. They also have high vigility, which means they're very good dispersers. They can spread across the landscape pretty well. A lot of times they are parthenogenic, which what that means is that it's when females will reproduce without the need of a male. And they'll typically produce all female lineages. So they can just keep on reproducing on their own without having to worry about having males around, or finding a mate that they can mate with. That also goes into species that are asexual as well. They are pretty good at becoming invasive. And again, it's because you don't have to find a mate. You don't have to find a suitable mate. You can just reproduce. A lot of the times they have generalist habits, so they're able to live in multiple different types of areas. They're able to eat multiple types of food. They're able to survive in diverse areas. Then there is phenotypic plasticity, and what that is it allows these organisms to grow and occur in different ways in different environments. So for example, you could have a plant that's able to survive in both bright sun and in the shade. And when it's in the sun, it'll have tiny little leaves because it doesn't need huge leaves to get enough sun. But when it's in the shade, it'll grow large leaves because it needs a larger leaf surface to get enough sun. So it can change its form based on where it's living. And that kind of leads to a species becoming kind of a generalist, at least in habitat wise. So if they're able to change the way that they react to certain things, they're able to be in different areas, eat more readily. They also typically have broad native ranges. So again, that comes into the generalist type idea. And a lot of the times they are human commensals. And what that is those are species that benefit from living near humans. And you're going to hear about quite a few of those today. It's also been found that European species particularly seem to be good invaders for here. And there's a debate about why that is, but one hypothesis says that European species have been subject to more competition over the years because of the overdevelopment of humans in that area. And so they're competitively superior. So when they are introduced somewhere, they already kind of have a leg up on those native species that are there. Another is that Europeans developed sufficient sea travel first, so they carried with them those species and that are found in their homelands, and that could just be the species that co-evolved with humans, and therefore they have done well following humans around the planet. So again, human commensals. So those are a couple of reasons why they think European species kind of seem to be very good invasives. Well, not good for us, but they're good at it. And then we have communities that are vulnerable to invasives. And while all communities can have invasives, obviously you can find invasives pretty much anywhere on Earth, there are quite a few communities that are exceptionally vulnerable. And the main one is really islands. So islands are smaller areas and they have relatively impoverished biotas and possibly more open niches. So there's more places for these invasives to fill. So because these islands have been kept away from everything else, they kind of are less tested evolutionarily. They've had less competition. They've had less invasion until humans. They've had less evolutionary testing over time. So the organisms that islands contain are often poor competitors. And when invasive species get there, they're able to really quickly outcompete these native species that have never come across anything like this and never had to evolve to deal with things like this. Another community that's vulnerable to invasives are human disturbed areas. And that's because not as many species that are native are selected to live there. They're harsh environments, the human disturbed areas. So you have to be specifically suited to live in these types of areas. There's also early successional areas, which the plants are just starting to grow up in those areas and you don't have all of your niches filled. So there's more open for your invasives to come in and grab a hold of. Areas with low native diversity and a low connectivity of food webs are also particularly vulnerable. And again, that's because there are open niches available. So you don't have the diversity that you need to fill every single niche, so it leaves openings for invasives to come in and just take hold of that role. Areas with the absence of native predators. So if there's nothing eating the invasive species, then they're going to be having a much easier time at surviving there. There's also an issue with communities that have an absence of regular fire. So we typically view forest fires as a bad thing, right? We're like, oh, we've got to stop these fires. They're a danger to people. They destroy habitat. But fire is actually pretty common and natural in the wild. Fire in a lot of communities is needed in order to keep the community going. So when you look at areas like the Pine Barrens in New Jersey, you'll see that a lot of the trees there are kind of burnt, and that's because there are a ton of fires that go through that area. It keeps the understory clear and it keeps the Pine Barrens as what they are. It's a natural thing there, and the species that live there are tolerant to this fire. But if you don't have these regular fires to wipe out new species, you're not going to have the protection against these invasive species. So if you have an invasive species that comes into an area that has regular fires, they're not likely to get developed and spread in time before the next fire comes. What makes these species in these fire habitats able to survive is there are so many of them, they're abundant, and they can grow to a large enough size that the fire doesn't harm them. So then we have tropical and subtropical climates. They are particularly subject to invasives, and that's because many of the invasives naturally come from these climates. So when you're bringing them to somewhere new and you're bringing them to a climate that they're used to, they're much more easily able to survive. And you're going to see some examples of that. And that's one of the reasons that Florida has such a problem with invasives. It's because they have the perfect climate for these invasives to survive. And we'll talk more about that in more detail. There are also some species that are vulnerable to invasives. So rare species in particular are vulnerable, and that's because when you have species that are rare, even if the invasive just kills a couple of them, it's a way bigger percentage than if it was a largely distributed species. So if you have a species that's only in a small area and it gets taken over by an invasive, they're more likely to go extinct than a species that is found in a large area. Species with vulnerable population sizes are also at risk. So when they're at a low number, there's much more of an opportunity for invasives to come in and take over. And that's seen in a lot of invertebrates, actually. That's been a problem with them. Then there's species that are close relatives of invaders. And the reason this is an issue is because the invader probably has similar nutritional and environmental needs. And because it's a good invasive, it's better at competing. So it outcompetes the natives and takes their food and their environmental needs that they have, and it doesn't allow them to get enough to survive. So the natives actually end up a lot of the times going extinct in an area. The United States has quite a few invasives. So the majority of our invasive species are plants and microbes, but those aren't necessarily the ones causing the biggest impact. So, I mean, they are causing a huge impact, don't get me wrong. We're going to talk about a lot of the plants and some of the diseases that have become invasive here. But some of the ones that stand out more and lead to the most having the most attention given towards them are the mammals and the birds. Those are the ones that typically get the most attention, and insects as well. And we're going to talk about a little bit from each of these categories so that you can kind of get an idea of the diversity of the type of invasive species that you can find in the United States. So I'm going to go through a few of the most notable invasives in the United States. We don't have time to go through all of our invasives or even close to a big chunk of them. That would take an entire semester long class. We only have one lecture. So I'm just going to I picked a couple of things from each type of organism and a couple of the ones that have been more detrimental for us to talk about. So we're going to start with fire ants. And fire ants were introduced to North America from South America. They're very aggressive. They outcompete native insects. And native insect diversity has been seen to decline by 40% in some of the areas where fire ants are more prevalent. So they cause a huge impact on our native diversity of insects. So they were an accidental introduction. We did not bring them here on purpose, but they were first found in Mobile, Alabama. And they do mostly impact the native insects, but they also impact a lot of our ground-dwelling vertebrates. And one species in particular that has been very negatively affected are the bobwhite quail. And they're affected because they nest on the ground. And these ants will actually go into their nests and invade and take over and kill all of their young. So in areas where the fire ants have shown up, the abundance of bobwhites declined by 75%. And that's just over 20 years of the ants being there. So they've caused a huge decline in this bird. And they're not the only ones being affected. Like I said, there's a ton of ground-dwelling mammals that are being affected and are being driven out and eaten really by these ants. Another pretty widely known invasive insect is the hemlock woolly adelgid. And this was introduced from Japan. It probably started with landscaping plants that were brought over, and it's actually pretty common around here. So if you find a hemlock tree, you can look at the branches, you can look at the underside particularly of the leaves, and you might see this woolly white substance on there. And that's actually not the insect itself, but it's actually a protective substance that they make, and they place it around the eggs and the larva. And then they will suck the sap out of the trees. And what happens is the tree will sense this, and they'll realize that something is happening that's wounding them, and they will section off that branch. So they cut off the flow to that branch. And they will so they stop using energy on a diseased branch. And what happens is the insects will take over every branch eventually, and the tree will not grow leaves anymore, and it won't be able to photosynthesize. So it will die. So that happens relatively quickly. Trees can die within a couple of years after the initial infection. And you've probably noticed, well, you might notice if you start looking, that many of the hemlock trees that are around people are having this impact even worse. So especially trees that are on like university campus, and then also ones that are within town. There are some forests that haven't been quite affected yet, but it is pretty easily spread. So there are a lot of areas where it's taking over and killing all of the hemlocks. And it's been particularly an issue in Pennsylvania because that is their state tree. So they're losing the majority of their state tree now. And they are trying to treat the hemlocks. The problem is you can't just treat a whole forest and then have them treated forever. They're finding you actually have to treat each individual tree, and then you have to treat them every year for this to take effect. So it's feasible if you have maybe a small patch of hemlocks and you want to keep them clean of the adelgids, but it doesn't really work when you have a whole forest. So another invasive insect that you may have heard of is the emerald ash borer. And this was introduced to the Detroit area in the 1990s. And since then, it's spread really widely. It's killed a ton of native ashes. It usually kills an ash tree within 3 to 4 years of infestation. And they are, again, found in New York. They're found around here. And even though you don't usually see the insect itself, there's a pretty telltale sign of damage. So you may see trees with their bark looking like this. They kind of look patchy. And you'll also see this little D-shaped hole where the insect came out of the bark. So that's a pretty telltale sign for them. So if you have any ash trees, take a look. See if you have these D-shaped holes on it, and you'll know if you have any emerald ash borer. Another really common invasive insect is the gypsy moth. So they're an invasive forest pest. They come from Europe, and they're one of the most damaging tree defoliators. Their caterpillars will feed on pretty much any deciduous tree, and they can wipe out an entire tree in just a season. In fact, at my house, when I was living in Pennsylvania, we would go outside when the gypsy moths were out, and you can literally hear them chewing while you're standing outside. You can hear thousands upon thousands of caterpillars chewing. And your car every day would get covered in frass, which is the caterpillar poop. It would just be falling out of the sky. So they are, when they're around, they're there a lot of times in huge numbers. So how these got here is a man named E.L. Trouvelot. He was interested in breeding a better silkworm. And so he brought the gypsy moth here from France. He brought it to Massachusetts in 1869, and some of his moths escaped, and they got into his neighborhood, and then they quickly became established. And when gypsy moths become permanently established within a county, the county it becomes quarantined. So this doesn't mean quarantine like what we're having with COVID, like you can leave the county. But what it means is when you're transporting goods from county to county, they actually regulate how items can be moved. So within a quarantine area, commercial export facilities need to have a compliance agreement with the USDA in order to legally ship their products across county lines. So you can see all of these red counties on this map are areas that are quarantined completely. And then other ones are ones that were quarantined previously or are quarantined in only part of the county. But there are a ton of counties that are in quarantine for this insect, so they have to have specific agreements with the USDA. The next invasive insect is the spotted lanternfly, and this is a relatively new invasive. So they were first detected in the United States in Berks County, which is a little northwest of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and they were actually confirmed to be there in 2014. So this is very new. Their tree of preference is another invasive species actually called the tree of heaven. And in areas where the tree of heaven can be found, which is actually a lot of places, the populations of lanternflies has become astounding. So even though it prefers these trees, it'll pretty much eat anything once it's grown up. So they're a type of plant hopper. So what they do is they have a long sucking beak and they'll stick it into the tree and suck out the sap. And when they're eating, they're constantly expelling excess liquid in the form of something we call honeydew. And this honeydew gets spread all around the tree, and it ends up creating this black sooty mold around the tree. And that kills all of the nearby plants. So the government has instituted a quarantine for the affected counties, and that's just like they did with the gypsy moths, but this is a smaller range, and that's because it's been here for a lot less time. It is spreading quite rapidly. In fact, this 2020 map that I have here has about 10 more counties than the 2019 map, so it's going pretty fast. So it's been expanding. They do have the counties in quarantine. They're trying to keep people from transporting things from county to county. But the problem is the lanternflies will lay their egg masses in the fall, and they look like this. They're pretty indescript, but they'll lay them on anything. They can lay them underneath your car. They can lay them on anything in your yard. They could lay them on anything literally they want to lay them on. They'll lay them on metals, on stone, on ceramic, on trees, on furniture that you have outside. And people don't notice they're there. So they'll move or they'll drive their car to another county because, why wouldn't you? You're just driving away. It's not about transporting goods anymore like the gypsy moth was. This is now becoming an issue with just the general public. And they'll drive around, not even know this egg mass is on their car, and in the spring they'll hatch out. So they're spreading really, really quickly. And you can see when they find a tree of heaven, you can see in this clip down here, it is insane how many there are. They will just be all on the side of a tree like that. You'll have thousands upon thousands of them just on the trees. The infestation is insane. And I actually come from right in the middle of the quarantine zone, so I have dealt with them quite a bit. And they are making it into New York, so they have been found in a lot of counties in New York. There's little red dots in the counties they've been found, but they're only established in a couple of New York counties. So they're probably going to spread more. We have not been able to contain it very well, but they haven't taken over New York the way they have in Pennsylvania yet. And you have to remember, this is only like 6 years this has been going. So they have spread quite a bit in just 6 years. So this is one that a lot of people don't know about. You might have heard rumors growing up that, oh, it's illegal. You can't kill a mantis. They're protected. They're not. In fact, 2 out of the 3 species of mantis that you can find in the eastern United States are invasive. Well, there's a couple of other very rare species, but the main species that you'll find, 2 out of 3 of them are going to be invasive. And the one that's native also is not very common. So I'd say probably almost every single mantid you've ever found has been an invasive. And the problem with these guys is that they are very indiscriminate eaters. So they will eat anything they can grab. And that includes native insects, reptiles, amphibians, small mammals, even birds like hummingbirds. Literally anything they can grab, they will eat. And they've been widely released by the public, not knowing that they're invasive. So people will buy egg sacs online. You can buy their egg sacs. They're called ootheca online. You put them in your garden and they hatch out, and the people think it's pest control. They put it in their garden, it'll get rid of the bad pests. But they don't realize that these are an invasive species, and the ones you're buying are actually the European or the Chinese mantis, which are not from here. And they are eating anything and everything, including your beneficial insects and your beneficial wildlife that are around there. And what has to happen is we need to spread awareness really about these guys, because so many people still think that they are native and that you can't kill them, they're protected. I still hear it all the time from people that mantises can't be killed because they're protected, but it's not true at all. So another one that most people don't know about are honeybees. And this is the European honeybee. So these are the ones that the beekeepers have. And they're very popular because they make honey and people love honey. And because people think, oh, they're pollinators, they need to be around. So there's been a lot of public concern about the decline in bee populations. And many people are calling for action to save the honeybees. But the problem is these aren't actually the bees that need our help. So there was a small decline in the honeybees that beekeepers were keeping, but that's pretty much gone right back up. And they're not native to our area. We have a ton of native bees that are in decline. And part of the reason that these bees are in decline is because of the competition that they face from honeybees. So honeybees have become widespread, and they've formed wild colonies that are escaped from beekeepers. And they will go to flowers, they will pollinate them, but they're taking all of the pollen and they're taking the nectar from the bees that actually are supposed to be here and need it, and a lot of our bees are declining. So people are worried about the honeybees because they know they're important pollinators, but they're not the only pollinators. We have a ton of other native pollinators. So we have flies and ants and other bees and wasps and even non-insects we have that are pollinators, like some birds and mammals. And they're just as good at pollinating. In fact, studies have shown that an increase in honeybees decreases the diversity of wild pollinators and actually hurts the pollination services that those species can provide. So there's a lot of controversy on this. A lot of people do not want to define honeybees as invasive. And that's because we are getting things from them, right? They are very important for pollinating our crops, but they are also hurting our native environments and our native species. So they're more important for crops and less important for native plants and animals. So again, the reason people don't want to get rid of them is because it's helping us, even though it's at the expense of the environment. So that's a very common theme when it comes to humanity. Another invertebrate that you probably might not have known about that are invasive are earthworms. So not all earthworms are invasive, but many of them are. And many of our earthworms came here from Europe or Asia. And they were originally transferred here by accident in soil bulbs of non-native plants that people shipped to the Americas to plant in their yards. And the lack of competition from our little small native earthworms allowed these larger earthworms to flourish. And what made it worse is the use of the nightcrawler earthworms in fishing bait. So most people don't know that when you're buying earthworms for fishing bait, they're actually an invasive species. So when you're done fishing, tons of people will just throw the leftover worms in the dirt. They're thinking, oh, I'm just letting them free. But they don't realize that they're invasive. And that's something that, again, needs to go into educating the public, because it's not something that's been done maliciously. It's not something that's been done intentionally. It's something that people just don't know about. So that has really supplemented their populations for years. And at this point, I'd say it's pretty much impossible to get rid of our invasive earthworms, but we can always help by stopping with adding to the population. So another invasive are zebra mussels. And zebra mussels were introduced to the Great Lakes from ballast water on ships. And what ballast water is it's the water that they hold in the base of the ship, and it helps with stability. So these mussels, they grew within that ballast water, and they got released as ships were going from place to place. And they've spread really widely. In fact, the management costs in the Great Lakes alone are more than $500 million a year. And since their colonization of the Great Lakes, they've covered the undersides of docks and anchors, and they've spread into streams and rivers in the US. In fact, they can grow so densely that they'll block pipelines and clog water intakes to municipal water supplies, and hydroelectric companies. So they've become a really big issue. But one issue that has been particularly bad is they've also been the source of avian botulism poisoning. And that's killed tens of thousands of birds in the Great Lakes since the 1990s. So they're responsible for the near extinction of a lot of different species around the Great Lakes system. They've also been outcompeting native species for food and by just simply growing on top of them. And they've suffocated many of our native clams and mussels. So they've become a huge issue. And you can see a lot of the United States is at a high risk for them to spread. They've been found in all of these areas where the stars are. They've also taken over in all of these yellow dot areas. They are everywhere throughout there. So they really spread through the eastern half of the United States. And it probably won't be long before they spread to the other side. Another aquatic species that is invasive that a lot of people don't know about are lionfish. And these species are native to coral reefs in tropical waters of the South Pacific and the Indian Oceans. But they were introduced, and I think it was around 1992 that they were introduced, when Hurricane Andrew destroyed an aquarium in southern Florida, and that released 6 lionfish into the bay. But there is some controversy there. They were common in the pet trade, and it's thought that the pet trade may have also supplemented that, and unwanted pets may have been released into the water. So they're particularly an issue in reef habitats where they eat many of the prey species, and they change the food web relationships. So that can ultimately lead to the deterioration of entire reefs, and it could negatively influence the trophic cascades in the reef. So, in fact, it was found that a single lionfish located on a reef reduced the young juvenile reef fish populations by 79%. So, it causes a lot of damage. So, moving on to an amphibian that is invasive, we have the cane toad. This is a particularly interesting scenario. So the cane toads, they're native to South and Central America, but they've been introduced widely around the world. And it was all around the same time that they got introduced. So there was this beetle called the cane beetle that was feeding on sugarcane. And people wanted to get rid of the cane beetle, so they released the cane toad. And that's why it's called the cane toad, because they thought it would eat the cane beetle. And so they released them to help combat those cane beetles in the 1930s. But they pretty much ate everything but the cane beetle. So they really didn't help with that at all. So instead, they turned their attention to other native insects, and literally pretty much anything they could put in their mouth, they would eat. And since the initial release, when they were released in, for example, Australia, they released 3,000 individuals. Now they have millions of cane toads. And so now they're found in places, they're found in Australia, really in high numbers. They're found in Florida, they're found in Hawaii, a lot of this, actually the southeastern US. So they've really been expanding very fast. And since they'll eat pretty much anything, it's skewing the food chain, and they're taking out a lot of our native insects, and that's reducing the prey for our native insectivores, and it's creating stress within the ecosystem. But there's something that's even more interesting. So typically, invasive species are an issue because of what they eat, right? Or because they spread disease. But this one is an issue because of the things that try to eat it. Cane toads are poisonous throughout their entire life cycle. So their eggs, their tadpoles, their adults, they're all poisonous. And whenever anything tries to eat them, they die. So we can't have a predator that would take care of them because nothing can eat them here. Everything just dies from trying to eat them. So there's also been issues where people's pets would lick a toad or grab a toad in their mouth, and people's pets are dying. And there's quite a few dogs that die every year. So in fact, in Hawaii, up to 50 dogs a year will die from cane toad poisoning. And people aren't safe either. So people have died from eating cane toads. They've tried eating them. They've tried consuming their eggs and soups, and they die. And it's weird. In Australia, I'm not sure if it's a lot of other places, but in Australia, it's actually become kind of a trend to lick cane toads and get high off of it. Which, I mean, to each their own, but it's become an issue as well because you can die from that as well. People are still doing it, but they have been a very big issue, and they're huge toads, like very, very large toads. So they can take some pretty large prey, and some larger animals will go for them. There have been instances of alligators dying trying to eat cane toads. So a lot of things have succumbed to the cane toad. And then we get into some birds. Pigeons were introduced from Europe and have become widespread in North America. They are really great human commensals, so they are wonderful at living near us, which is why when you go to cities, they are probably the #1 bird that you see in a city, because they can survive around people. And they actually thrive around people because we feed them and there's trash for them to eat, and they have pretty much everything they need there, and there's not really any competition because they're pretty much the only ones there. So the problem is they cause a lot of agricultural damage, and they also spread a lot of diseases. And the pigeon has a long history of being associated with humans. It's been used for food, it's been used for entertainment for over 5,000 years. So escaped pigeons from breeders will readily form flocks, and other stray birds may join them, and they'll become feral populations, and they'll take over. Another bird that is very common is the European starling. And this was introduced as an odd story. It was introduced as part of a plan to bring all the birds in Shakespeare's works to America. It was originally introduced in New York City in the 1890s, and it spread really rapidly, and it's now one of the most common birds in America. The problem is it causes crop damage, it spreads diseases, and the major issue is that it outcompetes a lot of our native species. So I'm sure all of you have probably seen these birds. They're pretty common, pretty much everywhere. They're here year round, and they do get a little bit more brown in the winter when they're not in breeding season, so they don't always look very pretty like this. Um, they will nest pretty much anywhere. They are human commensals again, so they thrive in areas where people are around. Um, I'm sure you've all seen them. If you haven't, just look outside and keep an eye out for them, and I'm sure you'll see one very soon, because they're pretty much everywhere. Sometimes they look a lot more black than that. That's them in the sun, so they're kind of iridescent. Another very common bird that you've probably all seen is the house sparrow. And they are from Europe. This is probably the bird that I see the most where I live. At my apartment, this is the only bird that I've seen in the past few weeks that come to the feeders. And we have dozens show up every day. But they are a relatively aggressive species. So they will take over nesting sites, they'll take over bird feeders, they'll take over territories, food sources, everything from the native birds. And they're not very large. They are larger than most of our sparrows because they're actually not even in the same family as our sparrows. But they are smaller than, smaller than a blue jay, smaller than the finch. They're about that big. And they were actually deliberately brought here again. This time, not necessarily it has to do with Shakespeare, but because when people from Europe came here, they wanted the wildlife that they were used to. So they brought a bunch of wildlife over and released it into the United States so that it was more familiar. It was more like their wildlife that they had at home. So they brought them here and they have taken over, and they are everywhere. Now getting to some mammals. One mammal that is particularly invasive is the Norway rat. This has now spread across every single continent with the exception of Antarctica. And it's the dominant rat in Europe and most of North America. It's a very good commensal, but they're very destructive. This is the type of rat you see when you go to a city. This is the only rat that you're seeing when you go to cities, well, around here. If you go down to Florida, they have other invasive rats as well. We'll talk about those in a second. But it probably got so widespread because it was a common stowaway on ships that were transporting people and goods. So people wouldn't even know that they were there, but they would bring their ship over, and the rats would come off the ship, and they have become pretty widespread throughout the entire United States, well, most of the world. We do have a native rat around here, and it's called the Allegheny wood rat, but you're not very likely to see them. So they're endangered. They're only found in specific rocky, secluded habitats. So if you're in New York City or you're anywhere in New York, really, anywhere around people, and you see a rat, it's a Norway rat, most likely. Another mammal that it's very controversial. I've gotten in many arguments over it. That are technically invasive, but people don't want to believe it, are domestic cats and feral cats. So this is something that has become a huge issue in conservation biology. There are a lot of arguments as to whether cats should be allowed outside. And a lot of people believe that cats should be allowed to go outside and should be outdoor cats or indoor-outdoor cats. And that's because they think that they were wild animals. They need to have some outdoor time. But the problem is, a lot of the times when these cats are outside, they're unsupervised. And they will sometimes breed with wild cats if they're not fixed. They will also go out and they will capture animals. And people will think, oh, that they haven't brought me any animals, or they've only ever brought me one thing, so they're not catching them. But what they've found is that cats, and domestic or feral, cats in general, will hunt for sport more than for food. So they will go out there and they will actually kill things and just leave them in the wild. And they've done a study on how many things have been killed by cats every year in just the United States. And they found that 1.3 to 4 billion birds are killed annually. Mammals are killed by 6.3 to 22.3 billion every year. Reptiles, 258,000 to 258 million to 822 million. And then amphibians, 95 to 299 million. So this is every year being killed by outdoor or feral cats. So there's been a huge movement in conservation to educate and try to get people to either keep your cats indoors, or if you're letting them outside, have them leashed like you would have a dog, or have them in an enclosure outside. So you can build a new thing that's been coming out, are catios. So like a patio for your cat. And these are ways to get them their outdoor exposure without having the issue of them impacting the native wildlife. Because they are pretty indiscriminate. They will kill a lot of different things. And it's not even just an issue for the native species, it's also an issue for your cat. There are a ton of cats who have died by attacking the wrong species. So they will go for a venomous snake, or they'll go for a larger mammal than they can handle, or even a small mammal. And if you get bit, they can get infected, they can get a disease from these things. So it's about the health of the cats and also about the health of the native environment. So now we're going to get into some plants. I have a couple of plant examples. And all of the plants I'm going to talk about are ones that you can find here in New York. You can find them pretty widespread actually throughout the US. And the first one is Japanese barberry. So this forms dense stands in open woodlands and wetlands and pastures and roadways, pretty much anywhere that there's an opening, it will grow. And it displaces native plants and it reduces the wildlife habitat. So Japanese barberry was introduced in the United States as an ornamental, and that was in 1875. And the seeds were sent from Russia to the Arnold Arboretum in Boston, Massachusetts. So in 1896, it was planted in the New York Botanic Garden. You'll find a lot of the invasives started in New York, and that's because a lot of the transport from other countries would come in at New York. So that's why a lot of them start in New York. But what happened is it spread. So it was being used as an ornamental plant, it was being used in people's yards, and it would spread out of the yards. So you can find it pretty much everywhere in New York now. You can find it throughout a ton of different states and in Canada. And it's all over the nature preserve. If you go hiking there, you'll see it. You can recognize it at any time of the year because it has these really sharp, thin spines. And unfortunately, it's almost impossible to eradicate. So it arrives in the woods by birds that will eat their berries. They'll eat the berries and then they'll poop out the seeds and they'll start growing. But it can grow in full shade, it can grow in sun, it can grow in established woods, so really anywhere. And nobody, even deer, will eat the leaves or the twigs. So they really don't get eaten other than the berries. And the berries, by eating those, you're spreading the plant. Another issue is it can actually take root anywhere that a branch touches the ground. So it doesn't come from one stem. There are a ton of different stems that are growing up out of the ground where it's taking root. So when you're taking it out of the ground, it's a lot of work to get it to go away. It can also grow from just small pieces. So it makes it very hard to clear clusters of this plant. And it also, its leaves will break down and it will raise the nitrogen level in the soil. So that encourages earthworms and it actually discourages native woody plants from growing. It also offers mice protection from predators because it's got spines on it and nothing's really going to go in there that's larger. So it encourages them to congregate under there and they're actually spreading disease to each other more often. And then also one that's kind of affecting all of us as well is the fact that it has such dense foliage. The area underneath it is moist year round, and so ticks can be there almost and active almost all the time. So they really have increased our tick populations and therefore also our Lyme disease populations. So it's been quite a bit of an issue just for native wildlife and for us. Multiflora rose is another species that was brought to America from Asia as an ornamental. So it was planted all over in the East because it has beautiful flowers, especially by people who are rose enthusiasts. And it's been taking over forest ecosystems ever since it was brought here. So the expansion was made even worse in the 1930s because farmers started planting them and using them as living fences to keep their livestock contained. So the problem is it's extremely prolific. It can form dense thickets and it excludes native species. Another plant that was brought here as an ornamental, so that's kind of a theme when it comes to a lot of our invasive plants, is Japanese knotweed. So it forms dense growths in riparian areas, and it's displaced a ton of our native plants. It's found all over campus. In fact, we did a study on Japanese knotweed in Bio 115 last year. And it's an issue because it crowds the area and it shades out native vegetation. So it reduces species diversity. It also alters the natural ecosystem, and it negatively impacts our wildlife's habitat. But another issue is the ground under knotweed thickets tends to have very little other growth. And when the soil is bare like that and there aren't a bunch of roots holding it together, particularly in riparian areas, it makes it more susceptible to erosion. So once and another problem is once they're established, the populations are extremely persistent and hard to get rid of. So you'll see them if you look at the Susquehanna around here, you'll see them growing all along the river. They are everywhere, and they're pretty. They have nice, pretty white flowers in the summer, but they cause a ton of issues. One final plant that we're going to talk about is Japanese stiltgrass, and this was introduced in 1919. It was actually used as a packing material for ceramics that were shipped here. And it's very tolerant of different lighting conditions, and it spreads rapidly, displacing native plants and forming poor habitat for native animals. And again, this is a very common species. You can find it in all kinds of areas, particularly areas that have been recently disturbed by humans. So another issue that I want to talk about is the vulnerability of islands. And islands are particularly vulnerable to invasives. One example is New Zealand. In New Zealand, humans introduced stoats and rats and cats and dogs, and all of these are predating on the native species that are in that area. So, and it's especially a problem with ground-dwelling species. So, examples would be like the kakapo, this one right here, which is the largest parrot in the world, and it's a flightless parrot, and there's only 209 individuals left. And because they lay their eggs on the ground, and because they're relatively defenseless, they have had quite an issue with animals killing their young, with the introduced animals killing their young. Another individual that's become quite impacted by these invasives are kiwis, another ground-dwelling flightless bird. They went from 12 million individuals to only 70,000 with the introduction of these species. And then we look at the tuatara, which we spoke about when we were talking about taxonomically unique species. It's the only member of its order of reptiles, and they've been decimated as well. So they're only down to around 60,000 individuals. And may seem like, oh, that's quite a bit, 60 or 70,000 individuals of each of these two species left, but it's really not when you consider what they used to have population-wise and how fast they've declined. So when you're on an island like this, many of these species evolved here without ever having predators that are able to kill them the way that these new species are. So they evolved here without these predators, and they're not able to protect themselves. They have no natural defenses. It's not like in areas on the mainland where they're used to some other species of predator. They have never come across these carnivorous animals like this before. So they've been really quickly decimated, and it's taking a lot of efforts to protect them. Now, luckily, New Zealand is very conservation forward, and they are working very hard to protect these species. They have breeding programs in place for them. They have a ton of money going into saving these species that are being affected. But because it's an island, it's all kind of happening at such a fast rate that it's hard to keep up. And you'll see similar things in Hawaii. They have lost a ton of species with the introduction of predators from humans. They originally just had birds and some reptiles, and they didn't really have any of these mammals that are causing these issues. And humans brought them over, and the native species are being outcompeted and also being killed. So islands have they're a lot more susceptible to the risks of invasive species. And then when you're looking at areas that have particular climates that are good for invasives, you can look at Florida. Their climate is so hospitable for invasive species, and that causes more of a crisis than anywhere else in the continental US. In fact, Florida serves as a point of entry for almost 3/4 of the plants imported to the US and the majority of the reptile trade. So with all of these things coming in, you're having even more things getting accidentally introduced into the environment, adding to the invasives. And because the climate is so perfect for them, they are able to thrive. So most of the invasive land vertebrates were brought to Florida through the pet trade. In fact, I put the top 9 invasive land vertebrates in Florida here, and 7 of them were caused by the pet trade. So many of these species have been purposefully released into the wild, and that's because people buy them and they can no longer care for them. So a lot of people will buy things like reptiles when they're small and not realize how large many of these species get and how much work goes into caring for them. And then when you get to birds, people will buy pet birds, not realizing that some species can live 60 or more years. So it's a lifetime commitment. And parrots in particular are sought after by people because of their ability to talk. But they don't realize they don't just talk when you want them to. They don't just say the things you want them to. They will talk and scream all the time. So much that people can't handle it. In fact, my boyfriend's old roommate has a blue and gold macaw, and he can scream louder than anything I've ever heard in my life. And he will wake you up in the morning with his constant talking. If you're not paying attention to him, he will scream at you. So it really is, it's an animal you have to commit to, and to commit to that for your whole life. Because they can live just as long as you can, sometimes more, and it's a very large commitment. So exotic species are a lot of work, just like other pets, and sometimes more than the typical pets. And people get them thinking these are low maintenance animals. And then when they have them, they realize they can't handle them, and they simply dump them into the wild. So if this was an area like New York, most of the species that would be released couldn't survive here. They couldn't survive through the winter, so they wouldn't get established. And there have been quite a few examples of people dumping their reptiles or birds in nature in New York. I've come across quite a few of them just since I've lived here for the past couple of years. And they never make it through the winter. So we always try to get them out of the wild, and okay, this isn't supposed to be here. But in areas like Florida, where they'll have semi-similar species and they have the correct climate for them to survive in, a couple of introduced individuals can thrive, and they can breed, and they can produce more individuals and eventually become established. So some examples: Burmese pythons were imported as pets. They're still being imported into the United States as pets. Many people have them. But they have been released in southern Florida, where they're now reproducing. The first individuals released were pets, and people dumped them in the wild. They will buy them at 12 to 14 inches, not realizing, oh, this snake is going to get to be like 10 or more feet. So they release them. It's also believed that a hurricane that hit Florida has destroyed a reptile breeding facility, and that had added to the invasive reptiles in the area and supplemented their populations. So they have been supplemented in other ways. But these Burmese pythons are predators on mammals and birds, especially in the Everglades. They've become quite an issue. And in fact, there have even been counts of them killing alligators and crocodiles. They will eat pretty much anything, and they get so large that they can take down huge animals, and they can eat quite often. So they're wiping out certain species. Another example, peafowl are thought to have become invasive when developers brought them into neighborhoods in the 1950s and 60s to make neighborhoods seem more exotic. So they were brought here, released intentionally, and they have taken over. Monk parakeets established wild populations in the 1960s in Florida and are now found in at least 14 different states. In fact, you can find them in New York City. So they've made it all the way here. But unlike other parrot relatives, they don't rely on cavities to nest. They'll actually build their nests amongst humans. So they're very good commensals. They are the only communal nester in their family, and they tend to choose man-made structures to make their nests. And that's become an issue because they like to nest at power plants. And annually, they cause over 1,000 power outages in southern Florida. So that costs southern Florida over $4 million in just 5 years to remove their nests. Then you have things like tegus and iguanas and chameleons and Nile monitors. And these are all invasive reptiles in Florida that are there because of the dumping of pets. And they were all introduced into the wild. They're all from similar climates, so they've all succeeded there. So these animals are eating native species of plants and animals and causing extreme disruptions in the ecosystem in Florida. And it's particularly an issue in the Everglades region, which is a very diverse area, and it'd be a huge shame to lose our diversity in that area. But then we have wild hogs. Technically, they weren't released as a part of the pet trade, but they were escaped domestics. So they were brought to the U.S. by early settlers as a source of food. And they're very voracious eaters. They are considered to be one of the most destructive species in the United States. And they've especially become a problem in Florida and Hawaii. And then there is the black rat. And that's the only species here that's not an escaped captive. It's believed that they came over as stowaways on ships that were transporting people and goods to America, just like our Norway rat did, but they have taken over in Florida. They're actually the most common rat in Florida, whereas the Norway rat is the most common in many of the other areas in the United States. So we have a topic of controversy, and that's a native invasive. So invasives are typically non-native species which cause issues with native species. They harm native species. But when you look at a species like the white-tailed deer, they are native, they are meant to be here, but they are not meant to be here at the numbers that they're at. So they cause similar ecological problems to invasive species. They could be considered invasive because they wouldn't have become a problem if it wasn't for human interaction. So we eliminated their predators, we modified their habitats in a way that suited them, and their population growth is because of us. So they've been detrimental to many plant species due to overgrazing. And an example of how extreme their deer population can get is when you look at the university's nature preserve. The nature preserve can sustain about 15 to 20 deer without any negative environmental impacts. That's the natural carrying capacity. But in just almost 200 acres of land, now we have 260 deer. So that's a 13 to 17 times what the natural healthy population size is. And you can see the devastation in forests so easily. You just look at the amount of understory. And when you can see a harsh line where the vegetation stops, we call that the browse line. That's as high as the deer can reach to eat. So they have eaten everything below that. They have completely decimated the understory. So this is controversial because we don't typically call native species invasive, but there's the idea that since we are the cause of this issue with this species and they are acting like an invasive species would, that they are technically kind of an invasive species as well. So now I want to go on to disease. So particularly we're going to be looking at diseases that humans have helped spread in some way or another throughout wildlife. So the first one is the chestnut blight. The American chestnut once dominated U.S. forests. It was thought to be 1 in every 4 trees in a forest would be a chestnut. And the wood was used for building. The chestnuts were used as an important food for humans and for wildlife. But an introduced fungus from the ornamental Japanese chestnut tree pretty much wiped out the American chestnut within 40 years. So they caused this chestnut blight, which was first reported in the United States in 1904 in New York City. And it quickly spread across the entire range of the American chestnut. And in the 20th century, it killed an estimated 4 billion trees. So it's estimated that in some places, like the Appalachian Mountains, the American chestnut was one of the most dominant trees. And mature trees often grew straight from branch free for 50 feet before they would have branches, and then we would be 100 feet tall. They had a trunk diameter of like 14 feet around. They were huge trees. They were very dominant in the northeastern United States. And since the blight came, they are pretty much gone. So it also spread to Europe, the chestnut blight, but the European chestnut ended up being more tolerant of this fungus than the American chestnut was. So they didn't have nearly as high of a mortality rate. But there are quite a few efforts to reverse this. So current efforts to breed a blight-resistant tree and spread them around the historical range has been going on since the 1930s. And there's approximately 2,500 trees growing in 60 acres near West Salem, Wisconsin. And that's actually the largest stand of American chestnut. It's the only large stand like that remains. And that's because it was outside of the native range. So these were planted trees. They were planted by an early settler, and they weren't within the range, so they didn't hit that spread of the chestnut blight that the rest of the country did. So scientists tried removing the trees that had the blight, and they were trying to control the disease when it first showed up, but they found it was kind of ineffective. And then they set out to introduce a hypovirus to the chestnut blight fungus, and they found the trees infected with the virus responded immediately, and they actually began to heal. And the problem was this virus was so efficient at getting rid of all signs of the fungus that it was never transported from tree to tree. It wasn't able to be transferred. So they would put it on one tree, and then they'd have to treat every other tree. So only the virus-treated trees were recovering. So we would literally have to treat every single tree individually, and that's kind of impractical. And if you missed any trees, any new saplings growing up would automatically get the fungus. But some good news at SUNY ESF, they actually developed a blight-resistant American chestnut, and it is currently in the evaluation process. But if it gets approved, the chestnuts can possibly start to be planted elsewhere, and hopefully we can bring them back. Another disease that's been pretty prevalent is chytrid fungus. And amphibian populations worldwide are being decimated by chytrid fungus. It's thought that it can thicken the skin on amphibians and it causes them to shed too frequently. And it also interferes with their respiration, their nutrient intake, and their water intake, and eventually it leads to death. And it leads to death pretty quickly, within 2 weeks of being infected. A ton of species have declined from chytrid, and multiple species have already gone extinct. We talked about the golden toad last time, or in our extinction lecture, we talked about the golden toad and how they went extinct from chytrid. And you can see here that there are a lot of species that are affected, and the severity is worse in the tropics. So we do have it in North America. There are species that are in decline, but it's very bad when you get to the tropics. It's got a terrible mortality rate. So it's become spread across almost the entire Earth. There's also a variation in Europe that is affecting salamanders, not just frogs. So bee-sal, it's called. And we're worried that that will spread from Europe to North America, because an issue is that the Appalachian Mountains actually have some of the highest diversity of salamanders on Earth. So if it spreads here, that can cause some huge issues with our salamander populations. But they've been trying to come up with some cures for this, and they've had some limited success. So an antifungal drug has been found to cure some individuals in a group of midwife toads, but it didn't prevent reinfection, so they could still get reinfected. So it's progress. But they also found a different antifungal. They treated yellow-legged frogs in Michigan, and so far it seemed to make them immune to future infection. And another study is looking at treating tadpoles, because they are the most vulnerable to chytrid fungus. And they would treat the tadpoles and release them, and the adults would be more immune to chytrid. So all of these techniques are being studied right now. They're all in early phases, so they have not been implemented widely, but they're hoping to find a cure. But what makes chytrid so difficult to completely eradicate and stop the spread is its ability to survive in the environment. So it can be transported from one area to another on your shoes, on your fishing gear, on leaves, on rocks, soil, logs, whatever, like literally anything. So it's recommended that people, when you're going from one wetland to another, or if you're going to a wetland and you've been in other places, you should bleach all of your equipment and your shoes before you go into this area. Another disease that we're going to talk about is ranavirus. And this can cause severe infections in a number of cold-blooded taxa. So it includes amphibians, reptiles, fish. It can spread between groups. And it's believed to be the cause of a lot of recent mortality events in amphibian populations across the world. It has a mortality rate of 90 to 100%. So it has the potential to eliminate entire species if it's not controlled. And scientists in the United States have identified it to be associated with mortality in over 25 states with over 20 different species of turtles and amphibians. So it's especially dangerous because it can be transmitted between species. So you can have a frog that has it and can transmit it to any turtles that are in the pond with the frog. And while we didn't bring this virus to the US or create this virus, we're a major factor in the spread. So like chytrid, ranavirus can be transported from one area to another. It can be on your shoes, it can be on your clothes, it could be on the tires of your car, pretty much anything that it comes in contact with. So when you're hiking or fishing in one area to another, they recommend that people sanitize their shoes and equipment to stop the spread, to help stop the spread. Um, so a lot of people aren't doing that, and that's not because they don't care. It's because people don't know. So a lot of people have no idea that this is even an issue. So again, we're getting into that idea that we really need to spread awareness. The problem is there's so many things that we need to make people aware of, so it becomes a big task. Another type of disease that, or actually this is technically a trematode, but if it's in the realm of diseases that is being spread, is Riberia. And this is a pretty large issue for amphibians. It's a parasite that attaches to tadpoles where their limbs are going to bud, and it causes splitting of limbs, and it ends in extra limbs or missing limbs. And what happens is it makes the frogs less adequate swimmers, and that makes them more susceptible to predation. So this is actually being made worse by human activities. An important factor in the infections is the exposure to runoff nutrients or eutrophication. So fertilizers have phosphates in them, which is also a predictor of larval trematode abundances in amphibians. And certain herbicides have been shown to weaken amphibians and their immune system, and that makes them more susceptible to these infections. And in turn, that causes predators such as birds to attack more and more of these frogs. So they'll hang out in the areas where more and more of these frogs with multiple limbs are found, and then kill them. And because birds are a part of the life cycle, they'll excrete the parasites, and it'll make them grow even more. Another issue is eutrophication also leads to an increase in snail populations, and snails are the first intermediate host for the trematodes, so that eventually increases the prevalence of all of the trematodes together. So really, even though we didn't start this, we're not spreading it technically, like we're not bringing it around on our shoes or anything. We are causing it to become worse than it had been. A disease that we can see in mammals is white nose syndrome, and this is affecting our hibernating bats. So they've been devastated by this fungus that causes a disease called white nose syndrome. And this was first discovered in Albany, New York in 2006. And it was brought over from Europe by people who would go caving. So it disrupts the physiology and the water balance of bats, and it also irritates them and it wakes them up in the winter. And that causes them to use their fat stores. And they need those fat stores to make it through hibernation. So when they wake up, they actually end up starving. It'll also break down the tissue in their wings and makes them unable to survive or fly. So they found that the little brown bat suffered a 98 to 99% mortality, and the big brown bat suffers 50% mortality. So it's very detrimental to these species. Bat species that were they used to be the most abundant, they've pretty much disappeared. And modeling is predicting that many of our bat species are going to be functionally extinct within 12 years in the United States. So this used to be confined to the eastern U.S. You can see in the spread here, it was spreading throughout the U.S., but on the eastern half only. But then we get to 2018, which we'll be at in a second on this map. And there it is. It pops up in Washington. So what happened there is there had been a spelunking conference, and people had traveled from the East Coast where they had been in caves, and they didn't disinfect their gear before they went over there, and they went into new caves, and then they transmitted it to the bat populations on the West Coast. So that was fairly recently. It has not spread nearly as much as it had in the East, but it will. It's going to spread more. And that's another reason we have to disinfect anything we use when we're going from place to place. A lot of us don't think of that, but it is a way that a lot of these diseases are being spread. One final thing that I want to talk about is distemper. So if you have a dog, you've probably heard of distemper. You give your dog a distemper vaccine when they're young. And the domestic dog has actually been widely responsible for introducing canine distemper to previously unexposed wildlife. And it now causes a serious conservation threat to many species of carnivores and even some species of marsupials. So the virus actually contributed to the near extinction of the black-footed ferret. And we're going to talk more about that guy when we get to reintroductions because they have had some success recently with them. But it may also have played a considerable role in the decrease of the thylacine, which we talked about in our extinctions lecture. It also causes mortality in African wild dogs, and this has become a very big issue recently. In 1991, there was a lion population in the Serengeti that experienced a 20% decline because of distemper. And then distemper also has mutated into a phosid distemper virus, which affects seals. So it can affect a ton of different animals. It can affect canids and pandas, wolves, raccoons, ferrets, skunks, cats, seals, walruses, primates. The list just goes on. It can infect so many different types of animals. And symptoms include coughing, fever, discharge from the eyes and nose. They have labored breathing and seizures, and it often leads to death. So it's been a huge problem. In fact, like I just mentioned with the African wild dogs, their population is down to 6,600 individuals across only 39 populations. And one population that got infected had a 94% mortality rate within the first 2 months of being infected. So this, if it gets into any of these populations and spreads, it can wipe out the species relatively quickly. So it is a huge issue right now. So that is it for this lecture. This is the last lecture of the week. Like I said, we're only doing 2, especially since these are longer lectures. And I will see you guys next week.